Welcome. This is a series of videos to inform the public regarding the truth of history entitled Lies About the Formation of the United States of America. This is lesson number 7, The Convention of Treason, May 15, 1787 through September 20, 1787, written by the Union States Assembly historian and the videos presented by Union States Assembly. This information can also be found on the Union States Assembly website at www.unionstatesassembly.org. We will be doing a brief information of some of the basic facts you have not been taught about the formation of the United States of America by the public and private fool systems, which is where Americans get brainwashed and are told lies. Let us look at some passages from a book very few people are aware exists. This book is entitled Secret Proceedings and Debates of the Federal Convention, written from the notes taken by Robert Yates, Esquire, Chief Justice of New York, and copied by John Lansing, Jr., Esquire, late Chancellor of the state. Members of that convention, including the genuine information laid before the legislature of Maryland in 1787-1788 by Luther Martin, Esquire, then Attorney General of the state, and member of the same convention, and the book was published in 1844. It is important to produce these documents in order to prove the truth of what Union States Assembly is presenting. Without such, this could be just another one of those internet speculation videos which many people believe as being true but provide no proof of such claims. Let's get started. The most important part of this book is the first chapter. A fully detailed writing exists on Union States Assembly website www.unionstatesassembly.org and it is entitled Excerpts from the Secret Proceedings and Debates of the Federal Convention. For purposes of this lesson, only bits of that document will be presented in order to demonstrate the mindset of some of the delegates and how their states thought. The following passage begins on page 17 and goes to page 27 of that book. This is an address to the Maryland legislature, and selective quotes are shown. Those who advocated the equality of suffrage took up the matter on the original principles of government. They urge that all men considered in a state of nature before any government is formed are equally free and independent, no one having any right or authority to exercise power over another, and thus without any regard to difference in personal strength, understanding, or wealth. That would such individuals enter into government, they have each a right to an equal voice in its formation, and afterwards each have a right to an equal vote in every matter which relates to the government. That, if we were to admit, because a man was more wise, more strong, or more wealthy, he should be entitled to more votes than another, it would be inconsistent with the freedom of liberty of that other, and would reduce him to slavery. That wealth attracts respect and attention. Superior strength should cause the weaker and more feeble to be cautious how they offended, and to put up with small injuries rather than engage in an unequal contest. In like manner, superior understanding would give its possessor many opportunities of profiting at the expense of more ignorant. Having thus established these principles with respect to the rights of individuals in a state of nature, and what is due to each on entering into government, principles established by every writer on liberty, they proceeded to show that states, when once formed, are considered with respect to each other as individuals in a state of nature, that, like individuals, each state is considered equally free and equally independent, the one having no right to exercise authority over the other, though more strong, more wealthy, or abounding with the more inhabitants. That when a number of states unite themselves under a federal government, the same principles apply to them as when a number of individual men unite themselves under a state government, and that by giving one state or one or two states more votes than the others thereby are enslaved to such state or states. So each state, when states enter into a federal government, are entitled to an equal vote. Adequate representation of states in a federal government consists in each state having an equal voice. The maximum that taxation and representation ought to go together was true. That to those who insist that he who pays the greatest share of taxes ought to have the greatest number of votes, it is sufficient answer to say that this rule would be destructive of the liberty of others and would render them slaves to the more rich and wealthy. To those who urged that for the states to have equal suffrage was contrary to the feelings of the human heart, it was answered that it was admitted to be contrary to the feeling of pride and ambition, but those feelings which ought to not be gratified at the expense of freedom. It was denied that the equality of suffrage was originally agreed to on principles of necessity or expediency. On the contrary, that is, what was adopted on the principles of the rights of the men and rights of the states, which were then well known, and which then influenced our conduct, although now they seem to have been forgotten. According to the principles of free government, the states had a right to that equality of suffrage, that from anarchy and confusion order might arise, that slavery was the worst that could ensure, and we considered the system proposed to be the most complete, most abject system of slavery that the wit of man ever devised, under the pretense of forming a government for free states. During the debate, we were threatened that if we did not agree to the system proposed, we never should have an opportunity of meeting in convention to deliberate on another, and this was frequently urged. In answer, we called upon them to show what was to prevent it, and from what quarter was our danger to proceed. Was it from a foreign enemy? Our distance from Europe and the political situation of that country left us but little fear. Was there any ambitious state or states who, in violation of every sacred obligation, was preparing to enslave the other states and raise itself to consequence on the ruin of the others? Or was there any such ambitious individual? We did not apprehend it to be the case, but suppose it to be true, it rendered it the more necessary that we should sacredly guard against the system, which might enable all those ambitions viewed to be carried into effect even under the sanction of the Constitution and government. In fine, sir, all these threats were treated with contempt, and they were told that we apprehended but one reason to prevent the states meeting again in convention, that when they discovered the part of the convention had acted, and how much of its members were abusing the trust reposed in them, the states would never trust another convention. At length, sir, after every argument had been exhausted by the advocates of equality of representation, the question was called, when a majority decided in favor of inequality. Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia voting for it, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, and Delaware against it, Maryland divided. On pages 28 through 32, there is the following. The states have a right to an equality of representation. This is secured to us by our present Articles of Confederation. We are in possession of this right. It is now to be torn from us. What security can you give us that, when you get the power the proposed system will give you, when you have men and money, that you will not force from the states that equality of suffrage in the second branch, which you now deny to be their right, and only give up from an absolute necessity? Will you tell us we ought to trust you, because you now enter a solemn compact with us? This you have done before, and now treat with the utmost contempt. Will you now make an appeal to the Supreme Being, and call on him to guarantee your observance of this compact, the same way you have formerly done for your observance of the Articles of Confederation, which you are now violating in the most wanton manner? The same reasons which you now urge for destroying our present federal government may be urged for abolishing the system which you now propose to adopt, and, as the method prescribed by the Articles of Confederation is now totally disregarded by you, as little regard may be shown by you to the rule prescribed for the amendment of the new system, whenever, having obtained power by the government, you shall hereafter be pleased either to discard it entirely, or so to alter it as to give yourselves all that superiority which you have now contended for, and to obtain which you have shown yourselves disposed to hazard the Union. Such, sir, was the language used on that occasion, and they were told that, as we could not possibly have a stronger tie on them for their observance of the new system, than we had on their observance of the Articles of Confederation, which have proved totally insufficient. It would be wrong and imprudent to confide in them. It was further observed that the inequality of the representation would be daily increasing, that many of the states whose territory was confined and whose population was at this time in large proportion to the territory would probably 20, 30, or 40 years hence have no more representation at the introduction of the government, whereas the states having extensive territory where lands are to procure cheap would be daily increasing in their number of inhabitants, not only from propagation, but from the emigration of immigrants of the other states, and would have soon double or perhaps treble the number of representatives that they are to have at first, and thereby enormously increase their influence on the national councils. Upon this compromise, a great number of the members so far engaged themselves that if the system were progressed upon agreeably to the terms of the compromise, they would lend it their names by signing it and would not actively oppose it if their states should appear inclined to adopt it. Some, however, in which number myself, who joined in the report and agreed to proceed upon these principles and see what kind of system would ultimately be formed upon it, yet resolved to themselves in the most explicit manner the right of finally giving a solemn dissent to the system if it was thought to be inconsistent with the freedom and happiness of their country. This, sir, will account why the members of the convention so generally signed their names to the system, not because they thought it a proper one, not because they thoroughly approved or were unanimous for it, but because they thought it better than the system attempted to be forced upon them. It did not appear to me that either of these illustrious characters, the Honorable Mr. Washington or the President of the State of Pennsylvania, was disposed to favor the claims of the smaller states against the undue superiority attempted by the large states. On the contrary, the Honorable President of Pennsylvania was a member of the Committee of Compromise, and there advocated the right of the large states to an inequality in both branches, and only ultimately conceded to the second branch on the principle of conciliation when it was found no other terms would be accepted. This, sir, I think it my duty to mention for the consideration of those who endeavor to prop up a dangerous and defective system by great names, the same spirit which caused our doors to be shut, our proceedings to be kept secret, our journals to be locked up, and every avenue, as far as possible, to be shut to public information, prevailed also in this case. On pages 33 through 36, we have the following. But on the other side, it was urged that none of those arguments could with propriety be applied to the formation of a federal government over a number of independent states, that it is the state governments which are to watch over and protect the rights of the individual, whether rich or poor or of moderate circumstances, and in which the democratic and aristocratic influence or principles are to be so blended, modified, and checked as to prevent oppression and injury, that the federal government is to guard and protect the states and their rights and to regulate their common concerns, that a federal government, if formed by the states as states, that is, in their sovereign capacities, in the same manner as treaties and alliances are formed, that a sovereignty, considered as such, cannot be said to have jarring interests or principles, the one aristocratic and the other democratic, but that the principles of sovereignty, considered as sovereignty, are the same, whether that sovereignty is monarchical, aristocratical, or democratical, or mixed with the history of mankind, doth not furnish an instance, from its earliest period to its present time, of a federal government constituted of two distinct branches. It was urged that the government we were forming was not in reality a federal, but a national government, not founded on the principles of the preservation, but the abolition or consolidation of all state governments, that we appeared totally to have forgot the business for which we were sent, in the situation of the country for which we were preparing our system, that we had not been sent to form a government over the inhabitants of America, considered as individuals, that as individuals they were all subject to the respective state governments, which governments would still remain, though the federal government should be dissolved, that the system of the government we were entrusted to prepare was a government over these 13 states, but that, in our proceedings, we adopt the principles which would be right and proper only on the supposition that there was no state governments at all. It is, in its very introduction, declared to be a compact between the people of the United States as individuals, and it is to be ratified by the people at large in their capacity as individuals, all of which said would be quite right and proper if there were no state governments, if all the people of this continent were in a state of nature, and we were forming one national government for them as individuals, and nearly the same as was done in most of the states when they were forming their governments over the people who composed them. Whereas it was urged that the principles on which the federal governments over the states ought to be constructed and ratified are the reverse, that instead of the legislature consisting of two branches, one branch would be sufficient, and whether examined by the dictates of reason or the experience of ages, that the representation, instead of being drawn from the people at large as individuals, are to be drawn from the states as states in their sovereign capacity, that in a federal government the parties to the compact are not the people as individuals, but the states as states, and that it is by the states as states in their sovereign capacity that the system of government ought to be ratified, and not by the people as individuals. It was further said that in a federal government over states equally free, sovereign, and independent, every state ought to have an equal share in making the federal laws or regulations, in deciding upon them, and in carrying them into execution, neither of which in this case is this system, but the reverse, the states not having an equal voice in the legislature, nor in the appointment of the executive, the judges, and other officers of the government. On pages 39 through 42, we have the following. Viewing it as a national, not a federal government, as calculated and designed not to protect and preserve, but to abolish and annihilate the state governments, it was opposed for the following reasons. It was said that this continent was much too extensive for one national government, which should have sufficient power and energy to pervade and hold in obedience and subjection all its parts, consistent with the enjoyment and preservation of liberty, that the genius and habits of the people of America were opposed to such a government, that during their connection with Great Britain they had been accustomed to have all their concerns transacted within a narrow circle, their colonial district. They had been accustomed to have their seats of governments near them, to which they might have access without much inconvenience when their business should require it. That, at this time, we find if a country is rather large, the people complain of inconvenience and clamor for a division of their courts are held, so as to render it more central and convenient. That in those states the territory of which is extensive, as soon as the population increases remote from the seat of government, the inhabitants are urgent for the removal of the seat of their government, or to be erected into a new state. As a proof of this, the inhabitants of the western parts of Virginia and North Carolina, of Vermont and the province of Maine, were instances. Even the inhabitants of the western parts of Pennsylvania, who, it is said, already seriously look forward to the time when they shall either be erected into a state or have their seat of government removed to the Susquehanna. If the inhabitants of the different states consider it as a grievance to attend the county court or the seat of their own government, when a little inconvenient, it can be supposed that they would ever submit to a national government established, the seat of which would be more than 1,000 miles removed from some of them. It was insisted that government of a republican nature are those best calculated to preserve the freedom and happiness of the citizen, that governments of this kind are only calculated for a territory but small in its extent, that the only method by which an extensive continent like America could be connected and united together, consistent with the principles of freedom, must be having a number of strong and energetic state governments for securing and protecting the rights of individuals forming those governments, and for regulating all their concerns, and a strong, energetic federal government over those states for the protection and preservation, and for regulating the common concerns of the state. That this ought to be an important consideration to such of the states as had excellent governments, which was the case with Maryland and most others, whatever it might be to persons who, disapproving of this particular state government, would be willing to hazard everything to overturn and destroy it. Nor was there a single argument urged or reason assigned which to my mind was satisfactory to prove that a good government on federal principles was unattainable. However, a majority of this convention hastily and inconsiderately, without condescending to make a fair trial, in their great wisdom decided that a kind of government which a Montesquieu and a Price have declared the best calculated of any to preserve internal liberty and to enjoy external strength and security, and the only one by which a large continent can be connected and united, consistently with the principles of liberty, was totally impracticable, and they acted accordingly. The preceding passages demonstrate the seditious and traitorous nature of the majority of the delegates or deputies representing the larger states, including the President of the Convention, in the wanting to destroy the Confederation by subjugating the smaller states. The plan was to unlawfully usurp the existing government, using their so-called celebrity status to wrongfully influence the uninformed, and then get the uninformed people within the states to commit treason against the existing governments by ratifying the Constitution for the United States. As was mentioned, the conventioneers clearly appeared totally to have forgot the business for which they were sent, as is specified by the Congressional Resolution of February 21, 1787. This the conventioneers blatantly violated. Besides violating this resolution, their actions were seditious in their approving a method to usurp the existing government by an unlawful process. Then again, by using their celebrity status, were able to convince the uninformed feeble masses to form their state conventions and approve the ratification process, and thus making those uninformed people commit treason against the existing confederation and eventual slaves to a new form of government which also enslaved their states. So now you know why the convention had so much secrecy surrounding it. As a collective, they were committing sedition and treason against the lawful governments. I can only think of a few things after reading all of this and how the larger states treated the smaller states. 1. Extortion. 2. Blackmail. 3. Making them an offer they can't refuse. Where have we seen that before? And what type of organization was that? Don't the current corporate, federal, state, county, and municipal governments act the same way today? How are you doing with that or them?